Right, thanks so much for joining, everyone. So I started the webinar now, so we'll see people come in. We've got people coming in already. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll get started in a couple of minutes. When I can see that it's stable, I can just see the numbers go up, which is great. Thanks so much, everyone, for taking the time to join us today. And this is the third Chronos Hub educational webinar that we're running. So we started off in January with a webinar focused on institutional agreements, making them more accessible for authors. In February, we talk about partnerships between tech companies and publishers. And then we had a little break where we ran some researcher-focused webinars based on introductions to open access and what are APCs and what are funders. And now we're back on track with the monthly educational webinars. So today we're here to talk about article submission and open access and the effects of publishers, institution and submission system providers. So I've got three great speakers with me today here. We've got, in the order that I can see them, Matthew Goddard from Iowa State University, Matt Day from Cambridge University Press, and Kathleen Horgan from Aries. And I'm going to refer to Matthew and Matt. That's what I used to distinguish the two. I'll try and be consistent with that. Hope there won't be too much confusion. Yeah, so what we want to talk about today really is article submission and the effects for the different stakeholders. So one of the key themes of all the webinars that we've run as Chronos Hub is to bring in different stakeholders in the ecosystem, publishers, institutions, authors, technology partners, to really have like a multifaceted discussion on different topics that we pick out. And the format for today is they'll do very brief introductions. Everyone's got about 3 to 4 minutes to introduce themselves, the organizations and the challenges they faced in relation to article submission and workflow for authors and how open access has changed that and brought about challenges in the organization. After the initial introduction, we then move on to 3 topics: open access agreements, agreement recognition, and author experience, where we'll have a bit of a discussion and then talk about next steps. Now, everyone, thanks so much for attending. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll bring them into the discussion as and when I see fit, or if not, we'll do them at the very end, which we should have time for. So I didn't introduce myself. I'm Romy Beard. I'm Publisher Relations Manager at Chronos Hub, and I'll hand over after a first introduction to Matthew Goddard from Iowa State University.
Great. Thanks, Romy, and thanks to you and Chronos Hub for the opportunity to share our perspective here at Iowa State as a library that is entering into open access agreements to support the open access publication of our researchers. And thanks for, of course, everybody for attending. So first of all, just a little bit of institutional context here. So we at Iowa State University Library have 17 open access agreements. And the chart on the right there shows the growth of our publishing, our open access publishing under those agreements over the last 3 years. And so you can see it's grown quite a bit. It's roughly doubled over the last 3 years. We don't expect it to continue to double, but that's going to slow down a little bit. But we do expect that this is, of course, the beginning of a broader shift of our subscription spend, shifting that over from funding, paying for access for our readers to funding open access publication for our researchers. And so, one challenge that we are facing is that we're entering into these agreements, but our primary users, that is our own researchers and authors, they don't fully understand these agreements. And I want to say right off the bat that within that portfolio of 17 agreements, there's quite a bit of variety. We have agreements with fully open access publishers, we have read and publish, we have agreements that are capped, we have agreements that are uncapped, where just one payment covers all publishing under the term. We have agreements that are based on APC costs, agreements that are based on the voucher kind of token concept, differences in how we manage the agreements on the back end, whether we verify eligibility, how we verify eligibility, how we pay for the agreements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that back-end complexity, though, we don't want that to ever result in front-end complexity for our researchers. And so, you know, the fact that they don't fully understand these agreements is really only a problem to the extent that they need to understand them. And so really, I think the way I want to put that challenge is that we want to really make sure that our researchers understand these agreements sufficiently so that they know what needs to happen in order to be covered under these agreements, so that 100% of what is eligible for open access publication under these agreements is actually getting published on an open access basis, and that we're handling the payments for those. And to address that challenge, I think the way I see it is there's sort of two directions of efforts, and that's kind of what the title of this slide is getting at. So you have, on the one hand, technical solutions, technical systems improvements, and I think we're going to talk quite a bit about that in terms of the publisher systems and these editorial management systems. But there's also more the social aspect, so the communication, the education towards better understanding, and eventually towards this broader cultural change where these expectations will sort of just be taken for granted, and no one will really need to think so hard about them. So that's kind of just a little bit of context and kind of what we're seeing here at Iowa State, and toss it to Matt.
Thanks, Matthew. So that's a great introduction. Thanks. I think the scale of the change that you're experiencing is very similar to the scale of the change that we're experiencing. So we at Cambridge University Press, we have about 400 journals across all subject areas: humanities, social science, and we want them all to be publishing open research as quickly as possible. So the vast majority of that research open access in or by 2025. And it's not just a case of throwing a switch and switching off our paywall. Every system needs to be rebuilt or modified in some way into a new system that works, so that instead of authors just submit to a journal and then we publish it and then we do reporting to the readers, well, now we've got to take an author, work how to associate them with who's paying for open access, and do all of our reporting based on an institute or whoever's paying for it, what they're publishing. So it's a massive system change, and it's just becoming extremely complicated. And I don't want to sound negative. It's a truly amazing thing, and it's a very exciting process to be going through. But fundamentally, it is just very complicated, and it's particularly complicated and confusing, I think, for authors. And hopefully today we're going to talk about the causes and solutions, or how to alleviate some of that confusion for authors. But it is difficult for authors, even if they've really bought into the concept of open access, which some of them are and some of them aren't. So I think really ultimately, what we need to start simplifying. At the moment, we are generally making systems much more complicated, more confusing, more difficult. We're constantly evolving. Well, there's some evolution and a bit of revolution kind of mixed in, different scales of change, but we're constantly changing and refining. And ultimately, we need to get to a much simpler way of publishing research outputs.
Right. And I'll hand over to Kate. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Listening to Matt and Matthew, that in thinking about our system, it is exactly the kind of conversations we have had as Aries systems. We have a peer review system, editorial manager, as well as a production system, production manager. And the data that we capture right at the beginning can help inform what the author experiences, the researcher experiences when trying to figure out, how does their research map to what their obligations are for fees, and what is that experience like? And then ultimately, it is where the institutions and the publishers can go to find the information about where and how their research is published. So there's a lot of different ways in which that conversation has evolved over time. And frankly, our challenge has been language. The way that somebody says, I have a transformative agreement, I have a read and publish agreement, I have a gold OA or a green OA, and which one's right or wrong these days. And, those are certainly aspects of what it is we're trying to solve for and support as a system. And as the industry clarifies what the best practices should be, we need to be prepared to support those things and potentially adjust some of the initial assumptions we've made. So that's our challenge, and really excited to talk about how we've solved for that through partnerships, and what our thought process is around partnership versus internal development, and where we've put those boundaries and adjusted them over time as we've all learned how to deal with those challenges. But the ultimate takeaway for us is that the workflow does not need to be a burden. The policies can be complicated. The experience doesn't need to be, especially when we have a really clear understanding and guidelines around how we capture required data, share that information, and guide the researcher, the author through the experience, and then the publisher through managing that experience.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of common themes in terms of the focus on the author, and that's what one of the topics we picked up on is the author experience. And I really like your distinction there, Matthew, about back end complexity versus front end complexity, and one shouldn't be as complicated as the other is. So as an author, you don't need to see everything that happens underneath the system. So that's maybe something to keep thinking about as we continue talking. But as you said, Kate, one of the problems is semantics, isn't it? Language. What do we mean by an open access agreement, or even like gold? Some publishers refer to gold away as publishing open access in a hybrid journal. So I find it quite difficult when we ran a recent webinars for authors, because there was that distinction as well. Well, some people mean gold is just fully open access, and others is gold if it's open access within hybrid. But what we want to talk about now is really a little bit about what do we mean by open access agreements. I like to use the term open access agreements because for me it includes read and publish, publish and read, transformative, transitional, but also things like agreements with fully open access publishers, as you've mentioned, Matthew, maybe membership agreements, like where you get a discount, but obviously it has the term agreement still in it, whereas it's a waiver that wouldn't necessarily be an agreement, right? Matthew, what other types of agreements have you seen amongst your 17 agreements that you would classify as somewhere along the open access agreement definition?
Yeah, I think that your list is pretty good. Read and publish. We don't really make a distinction between read and publish and read. It all kind of comes down to whether there's any sort of read access that comes along with the publishing privileges, or vice versa. It doesn't make much difference to us locally. We have a few agreements that I actually don't include in that 17 agreements, but we do have, I think, 2 or 3 that just fund discounts for on our APCs. We kind of handle those separately. So really the 17 agreements are that we really focus on, and that kind of most of my talks are most of what I have to say or thinking of are those that are funding the open access publication of our institutional research in place of publishing behind the paywall or an invoice sent to our publishers. And I do want to emphasize that we have a lot of other ways that we support open access. So there's obviously like Subscribe to Open, there's Diamond, there's a lot of investments that we make in what I would consider like open access infrastructure, so like the OA switchboard and DOAJ. But those other investments have a whole different set of challenges that I think are pretty well outside the scope of what we're discussing today.
Yeah, the scope here is really to focus on where is it important in the author workflow that authors don't need to know about it, but it needs to be taken into account during the workflow.
I think it's so complicated at the moment, and we've recently changed our terminology. We used to use read and publish, which people found incredibly confusing, and I never understood why they found it confusing, because to me, read and publish, I don't know how you could make it more a short statement of what's involved. But anyway, people did find it confusing, and now we switched to transformative agreements because that's the language that the funders are using. So I don't mind really, but I think the key thing is that everyone's really confused what these words mean. But you can't even define it at the moment. What is, there's so much variety, and that cap deals, uncapped deals, that involve certain journals or don't involve a certain journal, or the circumstances in which a deal applies and the circumstances in which it doesn't apply to a given author in a particular institution. It's just very, very complicated and constantly evolving. So I think in broad terms, we are talking about, some kind of an agreement that allows an author to publish as open access without having to pay for it. But there is a huge amount of variety in that still. And building the systems to support that and make it easy or painless for authors is difficult when the nature of the underlying deal and the information you need in order to administer the deal is constantly shifting as well.
From a system perspective, the way that within the peer review and production space is there's really 4 major personas. It's the author, reviewer, editor, and publisher. And with these conversations, there's this other role of the funder. And that's so much at the beginning of the research that it's been a unique experience to have for so long. That voice was just not something that we had to take account for in the workflow space. And it really felt, and I'm sure it didn't feel that way for the funders, but it felt very sudden for us that they came into the conversation and had a very strong point of view about how it is that they expected, wanted, needed these workflows to be managed. And from our perspective, we're like, whoa, what persona in here are we working with, and it's a little bit of both, and it's a little bit of a 5th persona that isn't really involved in the workflow, but has a very strong voice. So we're still working through how best to navigate that as well. And who do you listen to as the authoritative, need here when they're not, frankly, our customer as a business, but they are influencing our customers and the researchers that use our system. So it's been very unique, I would say, when it comes to, even for us. I see that in the chat we have a definition, trying to understand what it is that we're looking to build for a system.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really want to get in this respect. I think it's important to think about read and publish versus transformative. Is it a truly transformative agreement? Are we moving to full OA? We're talking here more about the workflow perspective. And it's interesting that you touch on funders, Kate, because obviously there's now also direct agreements between funders and publishers, where the agreement is that a funder will pay the APC directly. For example, invoices are directed to the funder, but for that in the system, you then need to capture funding information, right? So that's where you come in, and that's so important.
So Kate, I have a question for you actually. So when you're thinking about what you need to be doing next year, like your short or more medium term kind of roadmap, do you spend most of your time talking to publishers, or do you have a lot of authors that you talk to and some funders? What's the balance?
We typically, let me put it this way. Historically, it has been the publishers as our customer. We have partnered with OA Switchboard. We were very involved in finding the MVP to connect with that. So that had a lot of different perspectives as far as how we could integrate in those areas. And we do have industry engagement and conversations with various funders and engagement, but direct conversation with researchers, we tend to rely on the publishers to help facilitate those conversations because we do see those as their relationships, and we don't want to overstep in that way. So we partner very closely to make sure that we are getting the information we need, either from the source or with in partnership with those publishers.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I think we already talked a little bit about agreement recognition, as well as the different types of agreements that can make a difference. And I wanted to hand over to Matthew, who will talk a little bit from his perspective about agreement recognition from the institution side.
Yeah, thanks, Romy. So this is a big issue for us. So I described our challenge before, about ensuring that everything that should be published under these agreements is published under these agreements. And that partly that's that technology problem, and partly it's that communication or education problem. And I'm an e-resources librarian by trade. That's what I spend most of my days doing. Open access is a component of what we do in terms of managing all of our institutional agreements. But I've spent 11 years thinking more about e-resources than open access publishing. And so for me, there's this really helpful analogy from that world of what I'd consider traditional e-resources management. And that's what this diagram on the right is trying to portray. So IP-based authentication is, I would say, an example of a mature technology with relatively well-established expectations. And our faculty know that if they are in their office on campus, they can access our resources without having to think about it. It's a very seamless experience. They couldn't avoid using our resources if they tried, as long as they're on campus. And while at the same time off campus, they know that there are some certain rules of thumb that they'll need to follow in order to get that same access, like using the library's proxied links. And I think we all probably agree, if we have an opinion on it, that this is not a perfect solution. But I wanted to just cite it as an example where there's a relatively well-established technology and some cultural expectations to go along with that. And there's a bit of a convergence, and things more or less work the way people expect. And so that's where we want to get with these OA agreements. And there's currently not the equivalent of an IP address in this open access publishing workflow. And so on that side of technical improvements, we're obviously trying to be good partners with our publishers and give them feedback, and by extension, those publishers' own partners. Getting back to, I think, the conversation that we just had, it really does seem like the publisher is kind of the hub here, and then everything, all these other entities kind of converge on the publishers while they're all at the same time rebuilding their systems from the ground up. So there's I think quite a bit of burden on that, the hub of this wheel, but ultimately that the systems improvements feel a little bit remote from us. Similarly, I think to how our researchers feel maybe a little bit remote from Kate's work at Aries. What is a lot closer to home for us, of course, is those researchers. And so I just want to focus for just a bit on the things that we as a library try to communicate to our authors as kind of a minimum set of expectations for ensuring that their eligible publications are going to get published on an open access basis under these agreements. And so it's really three basic things, or maybe I should say two basic things and one slightly complicated thing. And the first of those is the corresponding author role. So with one specific exception, all of our open access agreements consider only the affiliation of the corresponding author as relevant. It's a kind of blessed area of standardization in an area where there's currently not a lot of standardization. So we of course have a lot of articles coming through these agreements that include authors from other institutions. And so this really represents a new consideration for this role. And as our authors are discussing among themselves which person within the group of authors should perform the actual submission and be listed as the corresponding author, that is one additional thing that they're going to need to consider when they're having that discussion, is just thinking about which of their institutions have these agreements with which publishers. And when it comes to agreement recognition, the second one is, this is really core, I think, as far as we have seen, is authors using their institutional email address when they're submitting their research. And because this is across, I think, most of our publishers, a primary way, not the only way, but a primary way of identifying eligibility and making that association between the submission and the author and the institution and its agreement. But what we've seen is that authors may be reluctant to do that. They do not all expect to be at Iowa State for their entire careers, and they may have a different email address in the future, and they may want to be able to receive correspondence about their research in the future. So I think from my perspective, this very specific item is an area where I think there's a lot of room for improvement on the technology side to provide more flexibility for what email is used for determining eligibility, and then on the other hand, what email is used for author communication after publication. And
so Matthew, it is really interesting to hear you talk about corresponding author, and what did you say? You called it a blessed piece of standardization, and I totally understand that. And it was the use of the corresponding author as opening the door to open access publishing has been there right from the very first transformative agreements, but I just cannot see it surviving. it's a misappropriation of an author's role for something completely unrelated, and it really limits it creates great stresses for us in thinking about, well, how are we going to transform all of our journal articles, because expecting everything to be paid for by the institutes of the corresponding authors probably won't work everywhere forever. So I think it's like, that's one piece of standardization we're gonna have to throw out. Would be my guess.
Yeah, you may be right. I mean, I could imagine a scenario in the future, once the necessary infrastructure is in place, where the open access funding would be maybe distributed evenly among the authors, perhaps. Is that kind of the model that you imagine in the future?
Possibly, yeah. I think personally, I would say yes, actually, but that is yeah. I mean, Kate, author roles, right? There's also, authors are supposed to be logging what their role is on an article these days. That's another one of their new jobs, isn't it, that they're going to be lumped with, I think.
Yes, and there's a lot of ways in which publishers do that. Some are leveraging something as simple as corresponding author, where this is the person that we, the publisher, we as a system, if there's an issue, would contact and be the delegate. That's not always the person, though, that should be the corresponding author for publication. Usually that's the more senior author, whereas the corresponding author from a system perspective does tend to be maybe a bit more junior, or sometimes it's a general admin that institutions have that kind of facilitates that process. So we do have ways to call out those two different corresponding author roles. And then when we start talking about things like how it's used for funding, it's easy enough to maybe include something like a checkbox. It could also be something that we consider when we think about credit. Credit 2.0 might include, and like a way in which, yes, I am responsible for these parts of the research that's been done, and I will be taking on responsibility for funding and all of that in the future. And maybe just expanding how we choose to use some of those industry standards. Some publishers still like to stick with their own lists. So, we can support all of them from a systems perspective. The more industry standards there are, the better. But yeah, there's no perfect answer for that one, unfortunately. Lots of variety.
Yeah.
And I think at the moment it's only PLOS that looks at co-authors as well as corresponding authors. Matthew, do you know of any other publishers that start looking away from corresponding author?
Yeah, we have one agreement that does not consider the corresponding author at all, and that's with PeerJ, and they do not. And that is because under their model, every author needs to be a member, and so our agreement with PeerJ actually funds memberships for our authors, but the co-authors are also going to need to fund their own memberships. Co-authors at other institutions, I should say.
Yeah, and what about institutional affiliation? Can you give us a sense of like how many publishers use? We talked about email addresses, but is there like an institutional selection, like for Grid Draw, Ringgold IDs, or is it free for all?
Yeah, I don't have a sense of what the breakdown is, but I mean, either of those two I think are pretty standard. So either the email address or some sort of institutional identifier that's populating a drop-down menu or whatever. It's not just a free text field where they're saying Department of Biochemistry, Ames, Iowa. What we would like to see increasingly is a sort of all of the above approach. So at that stage of identification, under I believe pretty much all of our agreements, we would like to see a really wide net cast, because in most cases we then have the ability to then go in and say like yes or no and approve that eligibility for these publications. So the broader that initial stage of author identification is, that's what we'd like to see, because the things that don't get caught in that net never, those never show up on our radar at all.
Yeah, whether if you get too much, you can always say no to some of them if you have approval.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think the only thing you can say for sure is that everything will depend upon good quality metadata, who the author is, where they work, who funded them, and that information can only really come from the author ultimately. So the author's life is going to change. No matter how smooth and simple we can make this, it is changing what authors will have to do when they want to submit
in
some way.
Matthew, did you want to say something about Creative Commons licensing? See that?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that last bullet point, the third thing that we try to communicate with our authors is about Creative Commons licensing. So one step of the publication process is, of course, signing a publishing agreement that assigns one of these Creative Commons licenses. And I think what we've seen is in some cases authors avoid that because they don't fully understand it based on the principle that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And so they just choose the default copyright agreement instead. So this is something that the library does education and outreach about, but I think I should add the caveat that we, at least so far, have not really tightly tied that education and outreach around Creative Commons to our open access agreement. And I think the last thing I just want to say about these communications is that even for our own researchers, as a library, this is not a captive audience, and most of them, like we've alluded to already, they're not, for the most part, inherently interested in this topic. I mean, there's a minority that are very heavily invested and really care quite a bit and are quite savvy, but there's this broader majority where they just want to get these things published. And so we need to keep things really simple and at a high level of generality. So if I was in an elevator and had to explain just to one of our researchers, this is how to get published open access, it would be corresponding author role is the one that counts. Use your institutional email address if at all possible, and spend 15 minutes reading up on Creative Commons licensing.
Thanks, Matthew. Matt, you wanted to talk a little bit about this agreement recognition from the point of view of Cambridge University Press as well. I'm having trouble finding my cursor to get to the next slide. There we go.
Yes, I think it's so sometimes when I view where Cambridge University Press is on its transition to fully open access publishing, it depends what mood I wake up in the morning. Sometimes I think, we've definitely come an incredible distance. We know where we're going, and we've come a long way, and that much I think is undeniable. But this question about it being just really difficult and confusing, sometimes I feel that we just need to be making much faster progress on that. And sometimes I just acknowledge that this is every part of what we do is being affected. And we work with so many different third parties, submission systems like Aries. Okay, right. So we have multiple partners. We have journals that aren't using a submission system at all, and maybe we can, or maybe we can't get some of what we need to happen done at that stage. And then when an article's been through the whole editorial processes, the production processes, some of it we do ourselves, and we use some third-party systems and vendors, and we use the Copyright Clearance Center for certain things. It's a very complicated map of all the systems that we're using. And we've had to rebuild them and tap into them and get them to do different things in new ways and to get everything working smoothly in the back, against the background of a changing policy landscape and a changing set of expectations or needs from universities, institutes, and authors and funders. So it's, so I even though I feel that I feel bad that it's so difficult for authors at the moment, or it can be so tricky for them and confusing. I feel we have to give ourselves a bit of a break. We've only really been committed to doing this across the board for 3 or 4 years. So we've got a long way to go, but it is extremely complicated. And I think it's but ultimately the basic point is we've got to get really good information from authors about who they are and where they are and what they're doing, and then we're going to need systems to act on that and make it really smooth. And then things will be able to. Then I think we will have a much more pleasant experience for everyone.
And do you feel like you resolved some of these issues along the way? I know you said we've only been at it for a few years, but do you feel like you've improved your systems to address it, and maybe perhaps not to the full extent that you want to?
Well, some of them are definitely improved. I think they're all improved. They're not improved enough. There is And actually, I think some of our lessons here, like how does an organization like Cambridge University Press completely change? So it's gone from a situation where some people liked open access and thought it was good, and some people who thought it had no place and would never work and was going to be a niche activity or would die out completely. How do you go from that to 5 years later, everybody really going for it and believing in it in a positive way? All of the different conversations and personal interactions and systems designs and everything has to change really, and everyone's got to be pulling in the same direction. And I think that and even though people like me who were really for this right from the start kind of understood that that was a difficult thing, I've totally underestimated actually how hard it is in practice, really. So I think you fix something works, it's great, and then you find out it really, something outside has changed, or it didn't quite work, or you underestimated it in some way. You're constantly reiterating, and that's just that will continue. That is just not going to stop. And understanding that that's the world we're in now, and that's good, and we have to be able to live in that world of constantly. You can never like write a description for something and then do it and say done. It's just like that will get us through the next 6 months or the next year or something. That's how it's going to be for many, many years, which is fine when you come to terms with it.
Yeah. And I guess for you, one of the challenges as well is being a bigger press and having all these different systems. For example, I'm just looking at submission systems. You've got multiple systems that you used. And I guess Matthew's in the same situation with all the different agreements. They all use different systems to submit to, and how author recognition happens. Would it kind of like one portal that would give authors kind of a new unified experience be something that would solve some of these problems, do you think?
Well, I don't think we would be here on this webinar if Kronos Hub hadn't thought that there was some scope for that, and we were kind of curious about it. So yes, right.
And I would say, I mean, from our perspective, in theory, that's wonderful. I'd be very curious, because it seems like one thing that in the midst of all this, great sort of idealistic push for open access, these are also publishers that want to retain their competitive advantage, and we should be clear about that. And so I'd be curious to know how sort of a standardized like portal like that would fit into that, which is one of the reasons why I think the OA switchboard has showed such promise, because it acts as something that allows standardization while at the same time facilitating that sort of competitive advantage.
Yeah, and it's just like, because each system is obviously slightly different, and Kate will take us through that a bit as well. I know you've been quiet for a while, sorry. But I just wondered if like more standardization in that aspect would be something that would make it easier for authors as well, because it's all nice and good having like one system that works really well. If lots of others don't, then you still have the kind of confusion on the author side if it's not super clear to them. I'll take your silence to just move us on. We've talked about author experience as well, and I'll pass it on to Kate to talk about this in more detail, please.
Yes. So focusing on the author experience, as has been noted a few times, the landscape has changed very rapidly from skepticism to just full embrace, as Matt said, over the past several years. And one of the ways in which we've had to adapt to that as a business is trying to really be strict about what are our Aries core competencies, which is workflow solutions, and where should we partner with others who have equally as firm core competencies in the areas that we need. It didn't serve us to continue to develop our own solutions to handle every potential flavor that could come forward. And the way that we've done that is through our partnerships now. We did go through a period where we developed our own solutions, and we still do, because not every partnership is accessible to all publishers. Scale, scope, size of a journal or a society or a commercial publisher, their ability to manage this workflow shouldn't be gated by a partnership or their size or volume or any of those things. So we do have some options native in EM. NPM that allow for functional usage and capture of the information and management of it, we do still rely on external parties to process payments. So PayPal is the most basic interaction, kind of standard PayPal integration. And then we also have APIs that allow us to have those broader partnership with Kronos Hub and CCC to process payments. We also have a way to capture and track some of those read and publish agreements where a publisher or may have an agreement with an institution, and they can configure those in the back end and keep those updated so that when an author submits, there's a tally that can run and flag to the editorial office or the publisher at whatever point in the workflow where they need to keep track of that. So that is a way, all the kind of varieties of ways in which we've solved for the varying ways in which publishers are choosing to handle the content that they receive and work through it. Something that has been really unique is that we're also, it's a very good use case for our current push with our developing product, Liquid Manuscripts, where we're actually trying to ease the way of authors and publishers and reviewers in a lot of ways, this specifically by taking the Word document, everyone still writes their content in Word, and extracting as much information as we can to populate some of those system fields with the corresponding author's name, institutions, eventually funding information, all of that so that there's a perfect match between what it is that's in the Word doc and EM, as opposed to expecting the author to go through their Word doc and enter that information. And what if it's, they mistype something and there's a production impact? The more that we can build out that extraction and have it be dynamic so that as the author updates their revisions and things, all of that metadata updates as well. And, an ideal future is that they stop using Word and start using the system when they log in. That is a understandable big task. But, that's our future goal, is to have updates within an editor within EM so that as they make changes, the underlying content is updated right within a user-friendly interface. And that goes back to standards. We've talked about standards a couple of times. It's something that, as Aries, I feel really strongly about. I actually feel comfortable saying any of the other, in the previous slide, any of those other partners that y'all work with are always probably talking to you about standards. And it could be anything from XML standards to things like credit, FundRef, ROAR, Ringgold, all of those things are so important to pick a standard because it does allow our system to talk to any number of other systems. And I think that if we look at take an even further step back, there's evidence that seemingly competitive groups are willing to work together to ease the way of researchers. And MECA is a really great example of that. All of the peer review systems and platforms got together and agreed, hey, we need to facilitate the transfer of content from one system to another and ease the way. That is predicated on publishers, allowing that sort of agreement back and forth, and that's fine. But there is a willingness and an engagement and an effort to try and find ways to standardize. I would say that it can be a challenge when we essentially are asking institutions and publishers in many ways to take on the role of entry-level tech expert to understand the implications of that. And that is not, the role. And we look to take that on and not put that burden on, but there is a level of education that we find ourselves in, not just around the technology, but really what the value of a standard is, and trying to take away the burden from them. To be the experts on things like JATS and Ringgold, ROAR, and how all that works. So it's really the capture and store of that data and the hygiene of it that is our core focus. And then regardless of what a researcher has to do, our goal is that it's really I like to call it a choose your own adventure, where author clicks and then it guides them to what they need to do next. They click again with, let's say they enter their institution, and then the back end is what handles that processing, either internally in EM or via the API. So all of that data is entered or extracted. You click a button and then magic happens and they're presented with the content on screen. So there's a lot of technology behind that. And I'm not saying the author experience is 100% perfect today. I think we would all agree that there's room to grow in a lot of our systems across the board. But as far as trying to ease the way and make it accessible, those APIs really can provide a seamless experience where you're leaving our system, going to a Kronos hub, coming back, that exchange and flow of information. The goal is to have that be essentially silent for the author's perspective. So yeah, that is our focus. We are really focused on continuing to evaluate the UX and UI as part of that to make it accessible to a variety of researchers, and make it so that journey is really crisp and clean for them.
And how do you go about doing that? Do you have workshops with authors to get input from them on what is easier for them to use?
We do. I think that one of the conversation points that I've lived through at Aries is our acquisition by Elsevier. And one of the things we've really benefited from is access to some of their best practices and standards around research and UX UI best practices. We were a company of 100 people, and now we have our own UX and UI folks in-house, but they have access to those best practices and knowledge, and can bounce ideas off of not just publishers, but also a partner to get access to the researcher, to reviewers, whatever part of the system that we're looking to work on. So feel as though that has been a huge benefit to us, that frankly, pre that relationship, we didn't always have the resource to manage.
And if we lead into the kind of last part of the webinar, talk a little bit about what's next, what are the steps forward do you plan to take it? You've talked a little bit already about that. Do you have any specific kind of next plans that you see coming up?
I'm happy to lead with some of that. I think that I know that there's a lot of joining conversations. So we're talking about mapping institutions and these agreements. There's also a conversation around identity, ensuring that the people who are submitting are, who they are. And one of the things we mentioned was using the institutional email address. For some publishers, that might not be possible. China, for example, there are, connectivity issues or content issues around that I'm not super familiar with, but many Chinese authors do use Gmail. And so we do have ways that we can help flag those situations within the system to have a vetting and a search go on. So, there's a lot of nuance to how it is that we're, allowing things like a Gmail account, which could be anyone. I could register a Gmail account, but it's necessary for some folks in order to get their content. And, how do you make it equitable? And so I think that's the conversation in all of this, is where are there competing priorities and nuance that we can bring to light? And that's what we are continuing to work on and partner with publishers on, and find ways to engage in those conversations.
Thanks, Kate.
I'll turn it over to Matthew. I'll just go down my screen.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. So, obviously we're going to be continuing to sign more of these open access agreements, growing the overall share of our institutional research that's being published open access under our library funding. We're also going to be continuing to work with our publisher partners towards the goal of 100% of eligible publications actually being published open access under the agreement. And I think the one thing that we see as coming up, and I think one thing that we're going to be talking about with more of our open access publishing partners is the opt-outs in the hybrid journal workflow. So far, all of the publishers that we work with, in fact, I think all of the publishers that are doing this still provide a way for authors to choose, if they're submitting to a hybrid journal and are eligible for open access funding, they can still opt out and publish behind the paywall. But what we've seen institutionally Our sense is that those who are doing that are not doing so out of a full understanding of all of the different factors. And so I alluded to the confusion around Creative Commons, for example, as maybe one factor there. So we are ready as an institution that's funding this open access publication to remove that opt-out, and that I think will help that challenge that I've talked about. Go ahead, Matt.
Matt, there's also a question for you that you might want to incorporate into your answer about whether you think, you've talked about complexity and whether you think going forward things will stay complex or become easier and with more shared business models and less variety.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, well, it has that well, okay, let me try and organize my thoughts rather than just like stumbling over words. It will have to become simpler. It will become simpler because it has to become simpler. And if we as a publisher can't make it simpler, I don't think we'll still be having our role as a publisher. I think there's something very fundamental about researchers needing to publish in an effective, efficient, cost-effective, you know, all of those kind of businessy words. And we have to be able to deliver that to survive as an industry. So if CUP can't do it, someone else will do it, right? And the landscape will change, but it will become simpler, right? And I think it will be a lot simpler over the next kind of 2 or 3 years. The publishing in a journal as open access will become a lot simpler for authors over the next 2 or 3 years. And that's publishing kind of compliance with the current funder landscape, you know, what the US government wants or what the UK government wants. But I think where things are becoming, it's really hard to see what's going on, is that there's the whole, you know, I mean, we publish books and journals. Most people that work on content in CUP's academic publishing division, I work in academic. Most people are in the journals team or the books team, and that's going to change, right? We're into preprint servers now, and there's going to be very different forms of communication. Different people publishing different types of information in different ways, going through different editorial processes, and it will all have to come on. It will be paid by someone. It will all have to be open access. There will be new ways of publishing in those new things and new venues that are tied back to the benefactor or the originator. So it's, you know, in some ways the landscape's getting much more complicated, and scholarly communication is evolving. So that change is complex, but the fundamental act of publishing in an OA article in a journal will become much simpler. I mean, I think it will. And the opt-outs, I honestly, I can't see well, I may be wrong on this, actually. I should be a bit careful. I can't see CUP being able to offer proper offer opt-outs, if I can get those words out, until the journals flip to fully OA. And there's no choice. An author has to sign an agreement that allows for open access publishing. And you know, so there's only one option for the author, and it's gold. And at that point, there's no opt-out. Yeah.
So you think to solve that issue, needs to be more focus on what Matthew started us off with in terms of cultural change and educating authors to make sure they're aware of the licenses and which licenses they need to sign.
Yeah, that's certainly useful at the moment. I do wonder though if yes, I mean, education and making authors understand what's expected of them, and giving authors the confidence that they're going to comply with their funders. That's really authors. What do they want? They want to publish in the journal and be accepted by the journal, and to keep everybody else happy. To keep anyone who's putting rules on them, they want those people to be happy. So the education of the author is about, partly, we will do all of that for you, or, you know, dear author, our institute will make sure the publishers of these journals will do that for you, you know, helping authors understand that their needs are being taken care of. But it's a bit of a race against the clock, because hopefully there just won't be the choices, and you won't need authors to even think about it.
Thanks, Matt. We've got about 5 minutes left, so if there's any other questions, please put them in the chat.
Oh, I didn't look at the questions in the chat that you asked me to look at.
I did.
Oh, sorry, I did. Yeah.
You did answer that. I pulled that out. But also, if there's anything else you guys want to add or ask each other that we haven't touched on yet.
I do. Realizing it, we're going through, as you do, accessibility reviews and things for our system. I'm curious how you manage, writing content or providing kind of succinct ways in which you can walk an author through what your expectations are. Like, how do you message that? Is it through, written text? Do you have videos? Like, what have you found to be successful in kind of managing the amount of information and kind of the if-then scenarios that you need to talk an author through? And how do you solve for that? Because it's something that we can struggle with a bit as a software system, where we will provide a text field for y'all to put in instructional text, but sometimes we see them and we're like, ooh, that's a lot of words. So how do you balance those things? How does that work for you?
Was that a question for Matt?
Yes, sorry, Matt.
Oh no, I was hoping it wasn't. No, that's it. That's the problem. We struggle with it. Really, very much. I don't, we can improve things. We are steadily improving it, but we're just trying to remove, everything from the author. So it's just here's your journal, hit the submit, done. Really.
Maybe that's our what's next, our open question.
Well, we're improving messages
yeah.
Sorry, Matthew.
Go ahead, Matt. I'm sorry.
Well, so one of the things, in fact, this is one of the things you constantly redo. We're reviewing messaging in submission systems, including Editorial Manager, your system, to look at messaging for authors around funder compliance. And you're right, there's text in there, and it's like, if they read it, will they understand it? They probably won't read it. Will it change their behavior? Probably not. Does anyone care? It's very hard. Yeah.
And I was just going to add that we're seeing similar challenges here. I emphasize like the communications that we're doing with our researchers, but really it's very minimal, and we're not reaching everyone by any means. We have a web page where we list our open access agreements, and those have some of the has the basic information about eligible authors, corresponding author. It also lists something about the importance of using your institutional email address. But who's looking at that page? I'm sure it's not a majority of our authors. We also have regular events on that are currently virtual events that we host, that we call them open scholar cafes. We do these monthly, and it's just a forum for our researchers and anybody within the university and within the community at large to discuss issues around open access. But the people who are coming to those are those that are motivated and invested and already kind of understand a lot of this. And there's this huge portion of the pie that is not really in that getting reached by that portfolio. And that's why I think we do need to get to this place where it's just automatic and it's seamless and they don't need to think about it. And some of the, Kate, the automated text extraction from the manuscript, I think that's, that sounds like a great feature that really helps us get closer to that.
Yeah.
It's, forthcoming future. Some of it is available today, but yeah, our goal is to have it be the full manuscript, down the line, so that it does ease that burden. But yeah, that will, in the interim, I'm sure there's work we can do and to make that better.
Yeah, that sounds really, really exciting, Kate. And I think we've heard of some challenges solved and some things that we think will happen in the future and still to work on. So I think it's time to wrap it up. So thanks so much to our three speakers for joining and the discussion. I think it's been really super interesting. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll close you up. If you want to stay in touch with other webinars that we've got coming up, please join our newsletter. Our next two webinars, end of May, so this isn't on our website yet, hot off the press. At the end of May, we'll have three speakers join me, talk about affordable and equitable access and publishing options. And at the end of June, we'll talk about open access and authorship data and how open access has made different stakeholders in the industry look at authorship data in a different way. So please join us if you can. And again, thanks so much everyone for joining, and thanks to our three speakers for taking the time and joining me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for facilitating.
Yes, thank you, Romy.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.